Hey you. Yeah, you. How do you feel about poetry? You must be at least a little bit curious about it, given you've clicked on this video. Maybe you took a literature class in undergrad and felt like you never really understood the poetry unit, or maybe you wrote a lot of poetry in high school, but now you look back on that old stuff and you think, okay, this can't be all that poetry is, right? Well, here on the channel, my goal is to show you that poetry is something that anybody can learn the fundamentals of and isn't something you have to be scared to learn. In this series of videos, I'll be offering some actionable, improvement-oriented critique to listeners who sent in poetry of their own. There's already one video in this series out, and if you're interested in seeing that one as well, you can click over to our channel page after this video to check it out. If you're more interested in hearing me analyze entire volumes of collected poetry, you can also see those on our channel page. Maybe after you listen to this video you think, okay, poetry isn't for me after all. That's totally fine. We have tons of videos on prose, especially infamous internet books, both on the podcast and here on the YouTube channel. I hope that you'll stick around to take a look at the kind of things we talk about, and thanks for coming to club. All right, with that pre-introduction out of the way, now for the real thing. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. My name is Jay, I hold a master's degree in creative writing, and I also designed and taught my own creative writing course while in grad school. Throughout this series, I'm going to be critiquing work much as I would have in the classroom, so if you're interested in getting the kind of feedback you might have gotten in a college-level creative writing course, but without the prohibitive cost, the time investment, and the sometimes questionable takes proffered by 18 to 20-year-old classmates, you're in the right place. Without further ado, let's get right into our first poem. We're going to start things off with our longest poem today. This is Ode to Elephant Hands by listener Schleikier. And I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, by the way. I've updated the poem submission forum so that in the future people who submit poems will have the option to add a name pronunciation guide. Anyway, here's the poem. When I was young, I would go to the bathroom and I would plug up the sink. I would turn on the limescale tap and wait for the basin to fill to the brink. I would submerge my hands in the body-warm water and I would patiently wait, with only the company of the faucet drip sounds and the feeling of placid waves. The tips of my fingers would dimple and wrinkle, but not in the way I would want. The backs of my hands weren't gnarled or knobbled or taut across tendons with knots. I would reluctantly drain all the water and dry off my hands with an old terry cloth, feeling the fibers inside of my newly carved grooves, only for them to all be wicked gone. I would run out upset over my naive fingers, and I would try to track down my mom. I would look down at her hands at all of her cracks and slide mine on her pachyderm palm. I would have ironed them out if it meant I could wear them, but instead I traced mountain range veins, comparing their dishwater blues to her jagged crag nails and how mine just didn't look the same. I would go gnaw on my own and try to match hers, and I'd nearly crack all my teeth. But my nail bluff angles would end up all wrong and I would just make the cuticles bleed. I would wrap up the pads of my fingers in gauze, covering nails that were cut to the quick. But I'd just trap all the moisture inside of my whorls and it'd prune like it did in the sink. The crepe of her hand was a delicate sort, self-conscious, wrought, yet kind. The whole universe, when I was a babe, I'd know their touch, even when blind. My yet wrinkled skin was a poor imitation. I convinced myself it would do, that it would be good enough not to forget her, but somehow I knew it untrue. A very musical poem I can hear, and one that I think benefits a lot from mixing up that musicality. It doesn't stick too closely to the meter that it establishes for itself. Anyway, I want to begin properly by talking about the title, which walks a nice line between being descriptive and enigmatic. It helps set my expectations. The word ode gives me some information in terms of the tone of the poem, and also gives me something to wonder about, namely, what are elephant hands? Which is a question I think more poems should cause us to ask. The first stanza sets a couple of precedents I'd like to look closer at. The first being the use of what I like to refer to as inherited language, after a concept introduced by Kim Adonisio and Dorian Laux in their book, The Poet's Companion. Basically, inherited language is any chunk of words that most speakers of the English language will already be familiar with. This could include the figures of speech that we traditionally refer to as cliches, which is a term that I like to avoid when giving feedback because it pretty much always comes across as chastising, and that is the last thing that I want. but inherited language can just as often present itself as phrases that most of us have heard before. Two examples from the first stanza of this poem are "fill to the brink" in the 4th line and "patiently wait" in the 6th. Now, there's nothing wrong with these turns of phrase in and of themselves, and in fact, in day-to-day conversation where quick and fluid communication is a priority, these stock phrases have a really high degree of utility. Laux and Adnesio describe these phrases as worn out, in the sense that they've been thumbed by so many readers and writers that any sparkle they may once have had is now tarnished. And as Laux and Adnesio also point out, they must have had real sparkle, these phrases, because otherwise they probably wouldn't have stuck around for so long. If we take a closer look at a phrase like "fill to the brink" and imagine we are hearing it for the first time, there's actually a really lovely tension to it. Brink is a word that almost only ever gets used in like a threatening or foreboding context, so for a vessel to be filled with the brink is at least theoretically to imply that something bad might happen if it gets any fuller. In actuality, though, readers won't be thinking about the specific associations of the words that make up phrases like "fill to the brink." Rather, they're liable to gloss over them because they are so familiar. When I catch myself deploying inherited language in a poem, and believe me, it does happen, one strategy I found helpful is to break the phrase into discrete parts and take a look at them. If I watched myself write the phrase "fill to the brink," for example, I would ask myself, which element of this phrase does my poem really want me to emphasize? Is it the fullness in the sense of bounty or satedness or completion? Or is it the brink with its aforementioned sinister associations? Other times, you can cut these phrases outright, or at least that's what I do. I think that this could work for the 6th line of the first stanza. We don't need to know necessarily that the speaker is waiting patiently. Instead, we could spend a bit more time with the company of the dripping faucet sound. All that said, this poem contains volumes of highly original language that I absolutely love. First and foremost is "body-warm water," which is as evocative as it is unsettling, and it even foreshadows the physical contact of the speaker's hands with their mothers. Then there's the company of the faucets dripping, which is an unexpected instance of personification that instantly catches my attention. And later in the poem we have, of course, "pachyderm palm," which is as playful as it is imagistic, right alongside "dishwater blues." Visually, this poem flirts with a pattern of alternating long and short lines, particularly in stanzas 3 and 4, but you can begin to see it emerge a bit earlier. I keep going back and forth with myself about whether this could be something the poem might benefit from capitalizing on. On one hand, it would seem to mirror the symbolic interlocking of the speaker's hands with her mother's. On the other, if this idea isn't iterated upon, it might come across as gimmicky, especially as we reach the later half of the poem. I think it would be worth trying it out, especially in combination with the suggestion I'm about to offer, and if it does end up becoming something of a gimmick, you could always cut it in later drafts quite easily. I'm going to try to avoid repeating myself since I keep bringing up this text in videos recently, and I'm sure that regular listeners are probably tired of hearing about it, but I do have to briefly reintroduce James Longenbach's types of line endings, which come from the book The Art of the Poetic Line. I don't know if I've said this bit explicitly before, but this book is really, really short and not expensive. I found a copy for like $5, so if you're even remotely interested in learning how to write poetry, I recommend picking up a copy. You can read it in a weekend. In essence, I think that this poem could benefit from dialing up the number of annotating line breaks, which I'm not going to redefine again here. If you're curious, you can listen to basically any of the last 3 videos that I've made about poetry. So, like with Andrew's poem in the previous episode, this poem contains some lines that could be considered parsing or end-stopped, depending on how you want to count them. For example, the line "only for them to be wicked gone" could end with a period if it wanted to be what we would call grammatically standard. However, it, along with all of the other lines that could end with punctuation, don't. The result, for me, is that every single line reads as parsing, which sort of hampers the poem's ability to use line breaks for surprise on the level of syntax, yes, but also on the level of rhythm. In The Art of the Poetic Line, Longenbach contends that the main reason to avoid the overuse of parsing lines is that they, when employed too frequently, and especially one after the other, call into question the necessity of lines at all, which can undermine the poem as a poem. Basically, if the line endings all guide the reader to pause whenever they would already be pausing during quote-unquote normal speech, why not just write fiction? At least that's Langenbach's sort of tongue-in-cheek idea. But you would have to be a psychopath to want to write fiction, so we're going to stick to poetry. However, I think that I actually ever so slightly disagree with Langenbach's analysis of the effect of compounding parsing lines here. For me, the effect of repeated parsing line breaks is less like reading prose and more like listening to someone talk in a cadence like this, so that after a couple of seconds, the listener can basically always predict where I'm going to pause, and it creates this unpleasant sensation like breathlessness. Although we aren't talking about strict meter here, and again, this is a very musical poem, but it isn't like rigidly metered, this question of how lines in a poem can best be broken bleeds into one of rhythm, at least for me. Whether or not you count actual metrical beats in the poems you read or the poems you write, rhythm is undeniably an essential part of the medium, which is something that I know Schleicher has already internalized because of the musical quality of this poem. So this critique is as much for everybody else as it is for Schleicher. The best poetry has a degree of unpredictability to it, and you can't be unpredictable if your line breaks predestine the rhythm of your sentences. Let me say again that this is a comment not in response to this particular poem necessarily, but to all beginning poets generally. If you want to have more control over the rhythm of your poems, but figuring out proper meter feels overwhelming or technical, there is a much simpler way to start. And that is by noticing the parts of a sentence where you tend to break your lines. Go through a poem you've written right now and ask yourself a couple of these questions. Do you like to break lines at the ends of sentences or in the middle? Do you break lines wherever there's a comma? How often do you break after verbs? Or how about between an adjective and the noun it modifies? Or a verb and the noun that it's interacting with? Or if you're feeling really radical, do you ever break lines right in the middle of words, maybe after a prefix or before a suffix? Some of these suggestions are more radical than others, but these are all things that you can do to immediately mix up your poems, which helps a lot if you feel like you're in a rut, stuck in some kind of pattern that you can't even identify. There's a lot more I could say about this poem, but I do believe there's such a thing as too much feedback. And I think that once Schleicher starts changing up the line breaks in this poem, adding a few more annotating ones if they decide to do so, that's going to create a bunch of knock-on effects that's going to cause the poem to change rather radically. So I don't want to give her too many critiques that will be impossible to implement simultaneously. This poem has excellent narrative and thematic bones, and the wealth of opportunities for improvement makes me really optimistic for future drafts. Thank you again, Schleicher, for submitting this poem, and good luck with your future edits. Next up, we have a poem called Broken Eyes by A.C. Mary, Dymphna, Francis, Kateri, all gone yet always staring, their eyes cracked in oil paint or broken to mosaic pieces, watching or blind. All molded into visions and ideas by someone who never met them but no doubt spoke to them every day, to therapeutic husks that weep for souls they'd never meet. Souls like mine, lost so deep that Anthony can't find us, Jude can't save us, that Aquinas can't even speculate. But here we are, dancing. We found ourselves in this miasma. We found ourselves beyond the saints, beyond mosaic tiles and cracked paint. No one weeps for our soul except you. A human with broken, bleeding eyes. This poem begins with an invocation of saints precious to our speaker, Mary, of course, who acts like a sort of catch-all who can intercede most directly on a Catholic's behalf, Dymphna, a patroness of mental illness, and then Francis and Kateri, both of whom are patrons of the environment. For anyone unfamiliar, Kateri was a Mohawk woman from the 1700s who converted to Catholicism after being orphaned. She was canonized just as recently as 2012, becoming the first Indigenous American saint. Now, I'm neither Catholic nor Indigenous, so what I'm about to say is strictly as an outsider and as someone who can only bring awareness to this issue rather than properly suggest how to proceed. Regardless of how any individual feels about Kateri's canonization, it is undoubtedly a subject that has sparked a lot of conversation among Indigenous people, especially current and ex-Catholics. Because there's such an intense debate about this topic, and it's not a debate the poem itself goes on to explore, I wonder if Kateri's presence in the poem, particularly at the end of the first line where it receives special emphasis, has the potential to distract from the poem's goals. This is a question we've encountered on the podcast too. Sometimes a philosophical question or social issue is so gravitational that, when included in a piece of media with other thematic priorities, it pulls attention away from the narrative or the poem's aims. Again, none of this is to say that Kateri's name can't or shouldn't be included. This comment that I'm making is very much me pointing to a question and leaving it up for you, AC, to decide. I wouldn't feel qualified making this call even if it were my own poem, to be honest. And again, mainly, I just want to raise all of our awarenesses about the ways that features as small as a single word can influence the way a poem is read. A reader might skim right past this name, whereas another reader might see it and wonder where Kateri goes. Moving on to the second stanza, I'm fascinated by the ideas the poem begins to develop here. The first stanza introduces us to the idea that for Catholics, the saints are simultaneously present and absent, in that they are present symbolically via their iconography, yet are not actually embodied. The speaker complicates this idea by introducing the confounding factor of the artist. After all, every iconographic depiction of a saint is just that, a depiction created by a specific person or people with their own interpretations of the saint they're depicting. This is, for me, the beating heart of the poem. The speaker is in awe of the depicted saint's ability to genuinely help people, even without being literally present, and despite being depicted by people who never knew the saints in life. What the poem is doing here has the opportunity to be enhanced by honing in on a specific example of this happening. For me, what immediately comes to mind is a version of this poem where stanzas 3 and 4 are replaced with ones where the speaker picks a specific depiction of a particular saint, whether or not the artist is known. If the artist is known, they can become a kind of character in the poem. If they are unknown, the poet can make up the artist. I think, via this hypothetical specific example, that the speaker of the poem would be better enabled to speak more concretely about the concepts introduced in the second stanza. For what it's worth, the poem could even keep its current ending in this hypothetical draft. It would be perfectly reasonable for the speaker to decide, after having considered both the artwork and the artist and the way that they relate to one another, that it is ultimately only humans who weep for each other. Maybe the speaker even decides that the icons themselves are the weeping of humans, human artists who find it to be the best method of expressing their pain. One small thing before I talk a little bit about title and metaphor. Unless the first word in a line of a poem is a proper noun or begins a new sentence, it's common practice nowadays for the first letter of that word to be lowercase. If you read poetry from even a couple of decades ago, you'll see that this wasn't yet the convention. Go to the Poetry Foundation's website, pull up an archived copy from a couple decades ago, and you'll see that the typesetting looked really different. While there are still some established living poets that prefer to capitalize the first letter of every line, doing so risks making a poem look old-fashioned in my estimation, maybe even stuffy. Personally, I also find that capitalizing the first letter of each line gives sort of undue emphasis to less meaningful words like or. It kind of announces the beginning of each new line in a way that I find affects the pacing of the poem and also draws attention from things that are more interesting towards something that is just kind of distracting. Now, like I said, let me talk really briefly about title and metaphor. I actually don't have any conclusions with this comment. It's really more questions. Broken eyes in the poem refers to two things. One is the broken eyes of depictions of saints, whether those are statues that are cracked, mosaics with pieces missing, or paintings that have faded. But broken eyes is also used in a metaphorical sense towards the end of the poem to refer to actual human people whose eyes are broken and bleeding. However, for me at least, it's not fully clear what that is a metaphor for. When the saint's eyes are broken, it's an indication that they can't see us, or rather that they can't see the speaker or Catholics generally. But when the human's eyes are broken, I'm not exactly sure what that means. I think it has something to do with crying or with the eyes bleeding, Maybe the eyes are bleeding because they've cried so much for human pain, but again, I just don't know. My question then is, how can we make what broken eyes means in the context of humans in the poem a little bit clearer? And I think that potentially engaging with one of my earlier suggestions, which was rewriting the third and fourth stanzas to expand more on the role of the artist and their relationship to the icons they create, could begin to answer that question. After all, if there is a version of this poem where the icons are the tears of the artist with quote-unquote broken eyes, that right there might clear up what this metaphor means. I know it's really important because the title points us there, and there's a nice chiasm between the title and the last line, both using that phrase, broken eyes. But I'm just not yet sure why the poem wants me to notice this phrase in particular. Thanks so much for sending in this poem, AC. It really reminded me of my grad school days. There were a bunch of people in my master's level workshops who wrote about Catholicism, and so I felt very at home in this piece. Good luck with all of your future drafts. Finally, let's round things out with a playful short lyric from Order of the Orb Fox member Dreikalith. Thank you for your support, Dreikalith. Now on to the poem. Emergency exit. You might take it as affirmation when I nod, that I agree with your statements, but I'm just worried I'll get dragged into one of the workplace gangs. Every conversation feels like a trap, like you all are sharks and I'm just a pup, fully aware I'll never be part of your gang. I'll begin with a really radical suggestion that came to me as I was looking at the way color is used in the poem. After my first read of the piece, I immediately started to wonder what would happen if you turned it into a contrapuntal based on the colors of the flag that the poem is structured after. For anyone who's unfamiliar, a contrapuntal is a sort of like threefold poem that looks like two poems standing side by side. Take this example by my former mentor, Meg Day. You could read either the left column or the right column as its own poem, or you could read straight across from left to right and top to bottom as a single poem, like you would normally do. Now, if you're thinking, that seems really, really hard to write, you are completely correct. This is probably one of the hardest modern forms in which to write, but they're also typically sort of playful, and this is a playful poem, so I think that even if you tried it and hated it, it might cause you to discover some enjoyable language along the way. Also, because the flag is divided into 4 rectangles that share a color and then a cross of a second color rather than 2 columns, you might have a bit more flexibility as to how the contrapuntal is divided up. The 2 leftmost rectangles might be 1 poem, the 2 rightmost a poem, and the cross a 3rd poem, and then the entirety of the flag a 4th, or some other combination. Again, there are lots of options to play around with this suggestion, so I encourage you to just start breaking things apart and seeing what happens. A bit more concretely though, I'm wondering if there's a way to rein in that one really long line which disrupts the flag shape of the poem. I do understand why it's there. The 3rd line needs to end in gang, because the words that end each line spell out this Swedish word, which Dreikalith let me know means emergency exit stairwell, pointing us back to the title. My question then morphs from one about the length of a single line into a higher level one. How important is it that the end words spell out that phrase? For my money, I don't know that it would hurt the poem to let that restriction go. After all, the flag shape is itself already putting a productive pressure on the lines. I'm also not 100% sure if I'm following what the phrase emergency exit stairwell has to do with the theme or narrative of the poem. The plot of this piece, as it were, seems to follow a speaker trying to navigate some workplace drama involving competing cliques, and while I can certainly understand someone wanting to seek an emergency exit from this situation, we don't actually see the speaker himself expressing or suggesting that sentiment. Instead, by the end of the piece, it sounds almost as though the speaker is resigned to be outcast from all of the different groups. To escaping the drama to a degree, yes, but also missing out on the privileges that accompany socialization. As with the previous poem, I wonder if some more specificity on the level of the narrative could be beneficial here. What is the figurative turf for which these gangs are competing? How did that fight start? Why does the speaker consider himself a pup and inherently more vulnerable than any of the members of the competing cliques? Does the speaker himself know the answers to any of these questions? Of course, this is a poem, so none of these questions need to be answered directly in the text, but suggesting that there are answers to a few of them could help ground the reader more firmly in the world of the poem, and grant us a deeper understanding of the stakes. Earlier, I half suggested shortening this poem's one long line, but it's worth noting here at the end that extending all of the short lines is just as viable of an option. After all, if we're going by the flag shape as a requirement of the poem, the only real restriction that places is that at the end of the day, the poem is rectangular, so the lines could really be as long as you want, so long as they're roughly equal in visual length. Thanks again for sending in this poem, Dreikolith, and I'll see you in the Discord. Hey, thank you all for coming to Club today. The first episode in this new series was really well received, and I'm grateful for everyone's support, so thanks again. We've also received a healthy batch of submissions since that first episode dropped, and my current plan is to pick a few of those for a third and, for now, final episode in this series, dropping within about 2 weeks or so. After that, I'll probably flip back into video essay mode for a bit, but I will absolutely be returning to this format in the not-so-distant future. So if you submitted a poem that doesn't end up being selected, don't despair. There will be future opportunities. Once I've picked poems for the third and final episode, I'm going to delete all of the submissions in the Google form. So what that means for you is that if your poem isn't picked, just wait until I drop another call for submissions and resubmit your poem from the start. That way there's no ambiguity about whether or not a poem is still being considered. Finally, thank you to all of our members, including Renee, Catherine, Hallucigino, Melke, Navari, Courtney, WandaVision, Peach, Zubin Kane, Window, John Pick, Will, A Marvelous Geek, Spookermans, Arthur Clybourne Writes, Milo is Tired, Evil Red Flame, Ren, Ace, Mallard Griff, Natalia T, Aiden, Sam, Dreikolith, and Pink Catsy. Once again, I've been Jay from the SBU English Club, and I'll see you all around campus.